the Mishcon Academy digital sessions.
Welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us for the latest in our series on the role of law in driving sustainability. This is a series that we've been running at Mishcons for a while, looking really at how the law could or should be used to accelerate and to drive action on some key issues to do with sustainability and a sustainable future, and how that fits in with what's happening in the world around us. And today we're looking at biodiversity credits and considering what's needed to ensure success and to mitigate risks in an emerging market. So I'm Alex Rhodes, I'm a partner at Mishcons, and I head Mishcon Purpose, which is our sustainability business. And I'm joined today by an expert panel, each of whom is working at the forefront of the emerging market in biodiversity credits. We've got Matthew McCluskey, who is a managing partner at Poseidon Capital, which is the leading green finance and investment firm. We've got Julia Baker, head of nature services at McDonald, the global management, engineering and development consultancy, and Glenn Anderson, who amongst other things is the project lead at Wendling Beck, the pioneering habitat creation, nature restoration and regenerative farming project covering 2,000 acres of Norfolk. And I wonder whether you could sort of kick us off by sharing how you're seeing biodiversity credits emerging as a market, including investor perspectives perhaps, and draw on reflections from your work structuring and capital raising in the carbon markets in particular over the last few years.
Thanks, Alex, and for setting the scene, which I think you've done incredibly eloquently, and I think it really sets the imperative for one, the urgency that is required here, but also the real ambition. And I think that's something which the BNG market in the UK needs to maintain, is to go beyond a minimum 10%, but really try and push the bar in terms of ambition. But then also the sentiment and excitement in this market. And I think for the first time, certainly in the UK's environmental sort of finance ecosystem, we've got a genuine mechanism that I think can channel a lot of institutional finance towards the conservation of UK, or more specifically English, natural habitat in this case. And I think, there are a lot of parallels with obviously carbon credits, but I think you've touched on some of the differences. I think carbon is traded, 1 ton of carbon is constituted as a commodity, as a carbon credit, and can be traded internationally. And I think biodiversity and BNG is, from what we've seen in functioning markets in Colombia and elsewhere, really only functions at a regional basis. So I believe there's very little, I think, viability in trying to discuss a global biodiversity crediting market, because I think biodiversity means very different things through different sort of spatial and temporal ecosystems. But I think just maybe sort of touching on some of the points around the comparison with carbon and some of the lessons learned. And Poseidon, we finance carbon developers, we structure offtake agreements, and we really do that for large scale projects around the world. And I've been working in environmental finance for quite a long time, and carbon is really the only market mechanism that can really fund the conservation, the operating costs of conserving large scale habitats. We haven't come across any other mechanism that can do that through market-based practices. And so I think that's why BNG is so exciting, because it can really leverage a lot of what's being done, both the success in the carbon market. And I think in that regard, it's important that we see this as an actor for good and not an actor for being perfect and something to be killed, which a lot of the press seems to be trying to do at the moment. And there will be teething problems as we go through this.
Julia, can I turn to you next? I suppose sort of on the demand side of life in a BNG context. you've got the coolest job, which is to bring nature into the mainstream in policy and practice, and really in the context of nature positive, I suppose. This is aimed to contribute to the recovery of nature while developing land. So we know the sector that we're focusing on here. And it'll apply to developments in the Town and Country Planning Act 1990 from this November, unless they're exempt, and later on, so in April 2024, to smaller sites too. Could I ask you just to talk, in terms of what you're seeing and your clients, how material is this going to be for them?
So with biodiversity net gain, it's measured by the biodiversity metric. So Natural England they've published a biodiversity metric, and you collect data on habitat, you run it through the metric, and it scores it in terms of these habitat units. So you have your habitats before works, your habitats after works, and you've got to get a minimum of a 10% increase in these habitats. So it's all about creating, restoring, enhancing habitats. Habitats need space. You can't squeeze nature into a corner of a site and expect it to be okay. So habitats need space. So one of the first discussions that we have with our clients, we kind of move the conversation on from a 10%, because what does that mean? Space, where's this going to go? And there's a spatial hierarchy. You want to invest certainly in boosting the natural surrounds of your site as a priority. And then if you do need to go off site, it's nearby, and DEFRA have made that very clear. But we work with a lot of clients who are minimizing their footprint because, that's in their best interest. It might be a commercial development, whatever that might be. And there is off-site need. There absolutely is. And it's really interesting listening to Matt, because the thing about when we go to our suppliers, there's hesitancy within the suppliers. Firstly, because they have to know what the demand is. Biodiversity net gain is really specific. These habitat units, it will be a woodland unit or a grassland unit or a hedgerow unit or a river unit. It's not just any old unit, can I have 10 please? It's really, really specific in terms of habitat type. So suppliers are being encouraged by the government to start their site and to grow their woodland. That's great. But what if the demand in their patch is for grassland? There's this really interesting interplay between my clients thinking there's not the supply out there, so we are trying to forecast their portfolio of what their demand is, so we can have that conversation in terms of this is what the demand is looking like. It's woodland units or it's grassland units, and it's location specific as well. It has to come with that ecological integrity. So we need to know the demand to enable the suppliers, but there's that demand supply discussion, which is really, really important. The other thing as well that I'm finding with supplier hesitancy is the point that Matt made about liability. Who's liable? Who is going to be liable if the developer goes, okay, offsite please, my 10 woodland units, is that supplier then completely liable? And if there is, exactly what Matt was saying, have they priced for that? Because it's a minimum 30 years. Now, it's not only to grow that woodland over 30 years and to get it in that exact condition that the metric says it's going to be in, there will be factors that come across with that. Prices go up and down. We've got climate change and all those aspects as well. So we're trying to work with suppliers to make sure that they're building in contingency, but they have to do so in a way that doesn't suddenly escalate the costs. And it's interesting. It's a really sensitive moment, I think, to get absolutely right, that balance in terms of fair pricing, but fair pricing to make sure that 30 years is a long time, to price for, make sure that that's in play, versus developers looking at their site saying, well, I could squeeze this in and that's going to be a bit cheaper, but that's not going to be in the best interest of nature. So we have to have that balance in terms of, we don't want biodiversity net gain on site when it's not going to be in the best interest of nature. We don't want barren sites and for it all to go off site, because that's not going to be in the best interest of nature. So it's this really sweet spot, which market can absolutely help with, but it's got to have those discussions to enable the market to establish.
Both Julia and Matt have spoken about the need for making sure that this investment in nature actually delivers. And there was a report done back in 2010 called Making Space for Nature, a guy called Lawton, and we now kind of understand that we have these Lawton principles of bigger, better, more, and joined when we talk about nature. So where developers are looking at actually offsetting this habitat loss and want to do the best, our view is that the more you can do that at scale, and the more you can do that in the way that nature works, and you have this kind of integrated network of different habitat types, that's really how nature thrives. Whereas a specific habitat type in isolation, you can get that to a high distinctiveness, but it's not necessarily going to deliver for the species. And as we go through to measure this as we go forward, and Matt rightly mentioned, the new technology that's coming in terms of satellite, eDNA, acoustic monitoring, all that type of stuff, that when we start to measure this, we're always driven back down to a species level. So we use habitat as a proxy for species because that we can deliver that, but there is this kind of unwritten kind of rule that if you deliver the habitat, the species will come. But we need to really test that as we go forward.
There's going to be a crucial sort of market management process that will need to ensure that in the first 24 months, all of the supply isn't just taken by the larger scale developers and speculative investors who have got the liquid capital to be able to buy this, and that actually the credits do start moving into where it's needed from developers. And if they don't, then there is a fear of market failure, because all of the demand side is going to say, we can't, it doesn't matter about price, we just can't get enough access to credits, or to units. So I think, yeah, it's going to be an interesting 24 months.
Just to jump in there, I'm already seeing that, the big developers have the resources to start having those discussions, and your smaller developers, they only want 1 or 2 units. It's just unviable for them to spend 6 months working with suppliers, trying to find them, whatever. So it's a very real risk that you raise there. Exactly.
And Julia, how is that going to be tackled?
It's a really tricky one, really tricky. I mean, this is when, how much of a hand will the government have in this, or will they want the offset market to just be established, or will it be down to the local planning authority? We all know that local planning authorities are stretched, but at the moment I'm seeing these one-to-one discussions being set up between the big players, the developers who have the resources to do so. The suppliers that are out there have a difficult balance between wanting, the big money. They've got big conservation projects, and absolutely, but individually, and this is another point to add, they've got to make up their mind which developer will they be an offset provider for. So that's an added complexity, particularly when you're membership organisations or conservation organisations. So at the moment, I'm not seeing any regulation of that at all, apart from what we're trying to do, which is support local planning authorities set up these habitat banks to have that individual transaction for the smaller developers. But there's going to be a time lag, absolutely.
So I've done a terrible job of chairing everybody because I've left myself 1 minute to wrap us up. And so I will do that. And I'm afraid, going to give you guys a chance to have a final blurb. So there are a number of things that come out of this, particularly on the, focused on BNG, of course. The question of price, the question of demand and supply, and particularly how enough supply is left for smaller developers. Liability is obviously, and particularly from a legal perspective, the question of liability for delivery over such a long time period is critically important. And Glenn, that ties in, as you say, to the question around covenants. The importance of the standard and possibly a mechanism to allow that standard to develop over time without disrupting certainty, and bringing forward some of the guidance on responsible bodies and others must be really important as well. So there's a ton of things that still need to be worked through, but this has been absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much, Julia, Matt, Glenn, and no doubt we'll be reconvening in a pub near here to continue this conversation. Thank you very much, and thank you everyone for joining us.
The Mishcon Academy Digital Sessions. To access advice for businesses that is regularly updated, please visit mishcon.com.